Hello, senior scholars. Tom Mandeville back. I'm at the Champlain Memorial Library as usual. And on Thursday, we left off in our examination of General Burgoyne's invasion of the Champlain Valley on the date of July 27th, 1777. And on that day, the tragic death of Loyalist Jane McCrae occurred near Fort Edward. And also on that day, Burgoyne's men complete the trail connecting Fort Anne and the upper Hudson to Skenesboro. So I'll be sending you out another chronology, volume 4 of our studies, and you'll notice the first thing on that is July 29th, 1777, 2 days later, the Americans make the decision to abandon Fort Edward on the upper Hudson, burn the barracks there, and also destroy anything that they had out on what was known at the time as Schuyler's Island, but is commonly known as Rogers Island today. Now, I don't know if any of you have visited the old Fort House Museum in Fort Edward, which sits on the grounds of where the fort was. And also, there's an interpretive center out on Rogers Island, because that's where Robert Rogers and his Rangers, when they were attached to the British troops at Fort Edward during the French and Indian War, were forced to encamp because the British, disliking Rogers and his men and looking down their nose at them, especially the officers, who I would argue were jealous of Robert Rogers and his skills, forced them to segregate themselves out on the island that sits right in the middle of the Hudson River, adjacent to where Fort Edward was. Both sites are worth visiting. On Rogers Island, there's an interpretive center. There's been a lot of archaeological digs on the island, and there's a monument to Rogers out on that island, and also the interpretive center is dedicated to the interpretation of the great Major Robert Rogers and his Rangers. So, the Americans pull out of there. On August 3rd, 1777, General Burgoyne will receive a letter that was dated July 17th, but obviously it takes some time to get a letter from New York City up to the upper Hudson River back in this day and age. And in this letter, General William Howe, who was supposed to all along take an army and move north out of New York City along the Hudson and ultimately join up with General Burgoyne and also Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger, who had an army out on the Mohawk River. Well, General Howe decided that he wasn't going to go north, that he was going to instead pursue George Washington and his army, who were in the Philadelphia area at this point. So he sends this message to Burgoyne saying, I'm not coming. I'm chasing Washington down in Philadelphia. Or that was his plan anyway. Obviously, this disappoints Burgoyne, but there's not much you can do about it. Then, you'll notice, on August 10th, 1777, General Schuyler is officially relieved of command by the Continental Congress of the Northern Department, as it was known. Those were the northern armies of the Continental Army. And General St. Clair is also relieved of duty that day, both of them being basically punished for the losses of Fort Ty and Mount Independence in the embarrassing fashion that they were lost that we studied in last week's class. And as I mentioned before, St. Clair will go through court-martial charges related to this, but will be found not guilty, and he'll go on to serve in the military for quite some time. In fact, he'll serve in early America and be engaged fighting Native American forces in the 1790s out in the Midwest in the Indiana Territory. Now, the next thing you'll notice on August 16th, 1777, is a big event. It's the Battle of Bennington. Now, what leads to this conflict, Burgoyne is now really experiencing problems supplying his still pretty large army with food and supplies. So his reconnaissance has reported that there's plenty of food and supplies in southern Vermont, that it is supposedly a loyalist stronghold, and there's also a lot of horse farms in the Bennington area. And he is in dire need of horses for his German dragoons that we talked about last week, who are in the unfortunate position of marching with those 12-pound boots. So he's going to send a detachment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Brahm, who is a commander of the Major Dragoon Regiment under Burgoyne. And they will consist mainly of these German soldiers, but there'll also be some Canadians and Indians. And their mission is to go to Bennington, Vermont, seize the food depots there, purchase horses, and rally support of the Loyalists to join Burgoyne and his cause. Now, before they can even reach Bennington, and before they even reach what becomes the state of Vermont, they're surprised by the Continental Army commanded by Brigadier General John Stark of New Hampshire, Colonel Seth Warner, our old pal, former Green Mountain boy, and Vermont Rangers commanded by Colonel Samuel Herrick, commonly known as Herrick's Rangers. In this battle that takes place at Walloomsmack, excuse me, I mispronounced that, I'm sure. Walloomsac, I've been there several times, so I can't pronounce the damn thing, which is in New York, about, as the crow flies, maybe 6 miles from the Bennington Monument in the center of Bennington, Vermont. That's where they're caught up on a hilltop, surprised by Stark, Warner, and Herrick, and they take a devastating defeat. They're wiped out. Americans suffer very few casualties, and nearly 900 of Burgoyne's men are lost. This is a complete disaster for Burgoyne. Needless to say, nobody's bringing back food and horses and rallied loyalists to Burgoyne and his forces. Now, this is known as the Battle of Bennington because the destination of Burgoyne's men was Bennington, but they were stopped before they could arrive by the Americans. But I don't know if any of you have been to the battlefield at Walloomsmack. It's a New York State historic park. It's a very nice place to go. And I'm probably, some of you have been to Bennington, Vermont, and been to the very impressive monolith monument that's there that rivals the Washington Monument in size. It's a very impressive monument. It's a neat place to go. You can take an elevator up to the observation area up top. And one of my favorite parts of it is there's a very nice statue of Colonel Seth Warner on the grounds. So that happens on August 16th, complete debacle for Burgoyne. This is when things really start to head south for him. On August 19th, 3 days later, General Horatio Gates, who's been now put in command to replace General Philip Schuyler, takes command of the Northern Department. He arrives at Van Slyck Island, which is a group of small islands known as the Sprouts that are at the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson rivers. That's where Philip Schuyler had been assembling the Northern Army, and the original plan was that's where they were going to make their stand and stop Burgoyne's army from progressing to Albany. But in the meantime, other scouts and reconnaissance units had been sent out to also look at other sites, and that's when they'll pick the location of Bemis Heights, overlooking the Hudson, where the battles of Saratoga actually take place. But originally they were planning on fortifying and defending Van Slyck Island, part of the Sprouts. So, Gates arrives, takes command. Then, on August 23rd, General Gates had commanded General Arnold to go west on the Mohawk River and to relieve the troops at what was known at the time Fort Schuyler, but now today it's known as Fort Stanwix, which many of you may have visited that historic site, a great place to visit on the Mohawk, because Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger's army that came out of Canada and was coming up the Mohawk had laid siege to Fort Schuyler. So Arnold and a pretty large force are sent out to help the troops at Fort Schuyler. And when Colonel St. Ledger reconnaissance reports of this large army coming towards them, they're going to abandon their siege of Fort Schuyler or Stanwix, and they will begin their retreat via Fort Ty back to Canada. So, this is another debacle for Burgoyne. It's sort of unclear why St. Ledger first goes to Fort Ty and just doesn't stay there to be a rear guard, or perhaps goes south to join Burgoyne and ends up retreating all the way back to Canada. So, another downfall for Burgoyne, and the things start to mount up. Then, about a week later, General Arnold, along with General Ebenezer Leonard's brigade and Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen, will arrive at Van Slyck Island. Now remember, Colonel Daniel Morgan had been captured at the Battle of Quebec on New Year's Eve of 1775. He was with Arnold then. He was gained back by the Americans in January of 1777 in a prisoner exchange in New York City. And as we'll find out, that's very lucky for us. Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen from what is today the mountains of Virginia and Kentucky will be very important players in especially the battle at Freeman's Farm, but also the final battle of Saratoga. So they all return. The army is growing in size at Van Slyck Island. And the next thing you can see on our handout is on September 8th, 1777, General Gates decides to move his now 10,000-man army and growing to Bemis Heights, located on the west side of the Hudson River, just north of the small village of Stillwater, and that's where the Saratoga National Battlefield Park is today, that many of you have been to. So he moves his men there and starts constructing fortifications in the whole region there under the command of our old pal, Chief Engineer Jeduthan Baldwin, and our Polish engineer, Thaddeus Kosciuszko. I think I got it right that time, but probably not. And they're going to build fortifications to block Burgoyne's advance on Albany there, instead of doing it back at the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson River. So, on September 10th, General Burgoyne starts to move his army south from Fort Edward, where they moved in after the Americans moved out, and they'll abandon Fort George. Fort George is sometimes referred to in the writings as Fort Marshall, and Fort Anne. They'll just abandon them. They won't leave rear guard there, quite frankly, because he's starting to run out of men. Burgoyne moves south on the west side of the Hudson to the Batten Kill. The Batten Kill is a very large creek, small river. Many of you are familiar with the term of calling a creek or a river down in the Albany area because of the Dutch influence, a kill. So, right where the Batten Kill empties into the Hudson, Burgoyne builds a bridge to be able to move his army across the Hudson to the west side of the Hudson River. And this, the Batten Kill, flows into the Hudson River just a few miles north of what was known as, back then, the village of Saratoga, which is, today, the village of Schuylerville. A lot of people are confused by this, and I know I was when I first moved to New York and didn't know much about the area. A lot of people confuse Saratoga with Saratoga Springs. And a lot of people, not from the area, think the Battle of Saratoga happened in Saratoga Springs. No, it didn't. It happened a good 10 miles west at Stillwater to the southwest, and directly west of Saratoga Springs is now the village of Schuylerville, which was known as Saratoga back then, which can be confusing. But those of you who have traveled in the region, you know what I'm talking about. The rest of you, look it up on Google Maps. You'll see what it's all about. So, he builds that bridge that takes several days to build this floating bridge. Then it takes a couple days to move his army across the Hudson River on September 13th through 15th, and then finally into Saratoga, which is south of where the bridge was. And the village of Saratoga is really about 8 miles north of Bemis Heights, and the bridge was, approximately 4 miles north of Saratoga. So they pull that bridge up after they cross, and that essentially cuts off all communications and supply lines to the north to Fort Ticonderoga, where Burgoyne still has a rear guard. Now, on September 18th, Colonel John Brown, no relations to the famous abolitionist John Brown, leads a raid on British forces near Ticonderoga. This is a surprise attack by Brown. He had been commanded to do this by General Lincoln, who was down in the southern Vermont area with mainly New Hampshire and Vermont militias. Colonel Brown leads this surprise raid, and in the process, he will free 118 Americans that were held prisoner there, and he'll take 300 British prisoners And this will further isolate Burgoyne's army, even though Burgoyne doesn't have any clue that this had just happened. So, all these events are leading up to our next big event on September 19th, 1777, the Battle of Freeman's Farm. So, I'm going to take a break right now, give myself a drink of water like I usually do, stretch my legs, and I'll be back to pick up with the Battle of Freeman's Farm. So, talk to you soon. Bye.